You're listening to In Coaching, your backstage pass into the world of coaching. I'm your host, Ioana Jongsma, a Gestalt and Neuromindfulness coach with a love for stories. I'm delighted to run this first season of the In Coaching podcast in partnership with the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland, where I graduated from my GPCC in May 2024. If you're considering becoming a coach, or you are a coach already and you're looking to upgrade your skills, the folks at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland would be happy to chat with you. You can explore what the Gestalt methodologies offer coaches, how they relate to the ICF requirements and certifications, and what would be expected of you throughout the Gestalt Coach Certification Program. My guest today is Juliann Spoth. Juliann is an executive and team coach and an organizational development consultant and educator. She has over 34 years of experience consulting and coaching for leadership assessment and development, organizational and cultural change, strategic planning, diversity management, process redesign, and high-performing teams. In the process, Juliann has served clients across 23 countries in 19 different industries and a variety of organizations, including global Fortune 100s, government, public, not-for-profit, and small family-owned businesses. Juliann has a PhD in organizational behavior from Case Western Reserve University. She's a Master Certified Coach from ICF with over 8,000 coaching hours on her log, a Gestalt Professional Certified Coach, a Board Certified Coach specializing in executive coaching, and an EMCC Global Accredited Team Coach. Juliann is a mentor coach for professionals pursuing their coach certificate at Case Western Reserve University. And the two of us would probably not be having this conversation today if she had not founded the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland Coach Certification Program,
What a great one.
where she was chair, director of training, and senior faculty for a total of 15 years, and where I had the privilege of having her as my mentor coach. Welcome, Juliann.
Thank you. I'm touched by your last statement because it was both a pleasure and a privilege to work with you in the Gestalt program. You're delightful to be with, but also so dedicated to being the best you can be in terms of the coach you want to be. And
Thank you.
you are dealing with coming from a couple of different cultures and having to adjust to not only the North American kind of U.S. culture, but also the Gestalt culture.
That's true. And it was a very international experience for me, I will say. So as a Romanian person living in Denmark, temporarily based in Portugal for the duration of the program, and studying with folks from the US, it was quite an interesting mix.
Yeah, and you know what I'm remembering is it took us a while to catch on to the fact you were so quiet in a large group setting was because of your cultural background, as you describe it, from Romania, in terms of disclosing yourself in a large group setting. That came out in a discussion we had later on, but that was a while. We noticed the behavior. It's just that
But you couldn't figure out what was up with that.
yeah, it's so talkative and so personal when you're in a small group or in an like our sessions when we were just talking back and forth. So that's a great example of what a cultural difference.
So culture code in Romania is when someone else is speaking, you're quiet because that is how you show respect.
Yes.
You don't interrupt. So it was an experience for me to learn to take space in a group of people who did not share that culture code.
Yeah, and it was a good reminder for faculty to be more sensitive, and especially when we also had people speak in a second language. You know, English was their second language. So yeah, and that changes things as well. Yeah. So yeah, right from the go, we were doing cross-cultural work with each other. Yeah.
Here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah. So, Juliann, you've been a coach for over 30 years. You've worked with individuals and organizations from 23 countries. What is that like?
It's astounding, it's exciting, it's confusing, it is evocative. It is such a wide range of experiences because there's such an amazing variation in cultures and therefore amazing experiences I have of them as well as myself in response to being there. And we're talking about cultures as something dimensional. It's also a physical cultural difference that is equally astounding at times. For instance, being in China is so different than being in South America. And how wonderful and how adaptable I have to be in order to reach out and really establish connections, given the differences in what I'm experiencing about myself there.
How does being a Gestaltist help you do that?
Several ways. The most basic is that we are really trained and we are oriented to start by noticing. I mean, how can you really formulate or have a great connection with another person if you aren't attentive and noticing, right? That's the first place to start. So it really is helpful because I keep my eyes, my senses, my heart, my head, I keep attending with all of those parts of me, and it allows me to notice a lot of different things out there. So that's one of the very basic places to begin that Gestalt is really extraordinarily helpful with. The second one is self-awareness. As Gestaltists, we are not agents of change, but really agents of awareness. And we also have a value of what I have termed as shuttling, which is not only awareness of out there, but awareness of in here. And so we intentionally voyage between those two, which is so very important in culture because you are trying to understand what is same, what is different, but also what's being invoked in you as a result and what does that mean for you in trying to connect with someone else who may be somewhat similar, but who is also very different. And therefore, what parts of me do I have to manage in order to be um, competent without being arrogant and being humble, but still having ego presence. So part of what I've been talking about is kind of being able to be those parts of yourself.
You've mentioned difference. What does that mean for you working with difference as a coach?
It's very sobering, actually. Culture is complex and multi-dimensional. So when we're talking about differences, we're talking about a possibility of a wide range of differences. So it is about the differences that are explicit, that you're conscious of, that you're aware of. And then you're talking about the differences of somehow you experience and you're not even sure what is the source of that difference. It just means
Like,
you don't feel. When I was in South Africa, it was during apartheid, which was 50 years of an extreme oppressive white government that caused a lot of violence and particularly noticeable against what they called their blacks and what they called their colors. And so I was there at one time when the people who ran their small buses decided to go on strike, and they were Zulus, and so it was only the men, and they were sitting under a particular tree that is traditional for them when they are having very deep conversations. I was the only woman there. So what I was aware of the difference is I was on the outside. I was not part of the culture. I was also a woman, and yet I wanted to be closer so I could hear what they were saying. So the peacekeeper who was with me asked them if I could come. So I knew, again, because of the difference, I kept very quiet, which is hard for me. I didn't ask any questions. I was just there to listen. But those were things I was aware of. What I was not aware of, I could sense a discomfort, and not because of those things, but there was a vague sense I was missing something. Okay. And as I sat there with it, eventually I paid more attention and cued to the nonverbals and other things that were going on. And this guy, actually, the guy who was leading it, a handle of a pistol was protruding outside of his pocket. And I didn't notice that right away. I just noticed how uncomfortable I was. So what I had gotten in touch with eventually because of that was one of the differences is I became more aware of I was walking into life and death situation here. That I originally was just out of curiosity and wanted to learn more. And then I thought, holy cow, this is serious business.
It makes me curious around how does an experience like that, and I'm guessing many others that you've had, how do they trickle into your coaching today when you think about this issue of difference?
Well, it is about going into a situation and automatically understanding I'm not going to catch everything here. That it actually encourages me to, in a way, to be more attentive, and in another way, not to be so externally attentive, to kind of check back in about what's happening in me and seeing if that will lead me to noticing something else that's beyond my current awareness, and not expecting myself to necessarily notice the most important difference or all the differences. And this word possibility needs to be put in here because these are possible differences. Because think about it, I'm using my own cultural lens to make these observations and judgments about what differences there are or are not, and how similar I am or I'm not. So I know that lens just skews what I see and experience at times. And in fact, what that question brings up for me now is that basically the literature and the suggestions for us as cross-cultural coaches are all Western based. They largely come from our cultures in North America and Western Europe. So they tend to be very white oriented and carry the cultural preferences and orientations from that culture. And I sat there after I was reading about that and thinking, oh, yeah. So it's not that just about Juliann and the culture I grew up in and my potential culture mosaic, as I put it, but is about, I'm so unconscious of even the stuff I'm coming to believe in or act on is a bias about doing cross-cultural coaching. And
So the way that we ask questions
Sure.
is biased by this cultural lens that we look through.
Cultural lens and the lens and what we end up believing is the correct approach to doing cross-cultural coaching. So I think it's a very, very good thing for us to take into account. So it's sort of like, yeah, they are research and there are good data out there, but there's a grain of salt that we need to have as part of being culturally aware of how we automatically come into this with our not just cultural biases, but biases about how to be a cross-cultural coach.
Right.
So,
Can you give me an example of what that might be like, such a biased belief about what it means to be a cross-cultural coach?
well, it comes up when you contrast the culture that Western Europe and North American culture. When you contrast that with an approach via an Asian cross-cultural coaching or East Indian cross-cultural coaching. In fact, there are 3 or 4 countries, I think it's called the BRIC, Brazilian, Russian, Indian, East Indian, and China cultures that are so very different. So if you look at what it would mean to be a cross-culture coach from our Western point of view, it would be all the things that we commonly talk about, like what perspective, how can you take a different perspective? How can you adapt to their perspective? But the questions are, if they're being a cross-cultural coach, how would that look differently? Because they're coming from a culture that is not trying, uh, and again, those are different cultures. But if you look at the Japanese culture per se, when I was working with a student who was from there, it wasn't about trying to talk about these things so openly. It's all that uh, high context way of not being so explicit about all of this and naming all of these things, but paying attention to the subtleties of language and of the culture of saving face and interacting with that lens.
I'll tell you how this lands on me. What it makes me think about is, for example, this is how we in the US and in Western Europe, we know how to bring things into our clients' awareness by helping them put names to things.
Yes,
and
yes.
maybe in another culture, that might make no sense or might be inappropriate, or it might just not even be something people care about. What does it matter what it's
That's
called? Maybe
right.
there's something else that is much more important in that context. So I can imagine that that approach to coaching would look quite different
That would
from
look quite.
ours.
And it's also this business, you use the word naming, but it's also about being explicit and verbalizing versus being more implicit, more, well, we're getting it, right? It's a different way of communicating from your cross-cultural lens. Yeah. When I'm talking about how to be a cross-cultural coach, how would that look different for a Japanese coach that is doing cross-cultural coaching, or a Chinese coach that is doing cross-cultural coaching, which in fact brings up another incident of when I was in China teaching about coaching. And it was really for a short thing. And it was for GE, who had a major presence in China and was asking me to come in and talk about coaching in this particular group, which was sales people. There were about 15 of these guys, all guys in the room. And they were about, I would say 90% at the time I was talking about this were actually texting on their iPhones, not even looking at me, you know. Uh, so it was not only noticing that, but I started getting very irritated. Luckily, at that time, as part of the way they worked with trainers, there was a native Chinese woman in the background present all the time. And during the break, I went up to her and I said, "This is what's happening. We're talking about this. This is what they're doing. I had wanted to say something, but I need some help from you in terms of what would be appropriate for this." And she said, "Don't say a word. I will take care of it." So on the break, she got them together outside and spoke to them about what they were doing And they came back in and they weren't resentful or anything, but they started being there with me and paying attention. Now, I had enough sense to know that there is something about saving face, but I didn't know enough to exactly know how I should approach this. And it was only because she had a sense of how to deal with this cross-cultural issue
Right.
and represented me. So there you go. Another
Amazing.
example of
Yeah.
how I knew enough not to know that I need to be careful here, but not enough to know how to be appropriately cross-cultural here. She did, and she took care of it.
Amazing. I'll share a faux pas that I made in South Korea last year,
Oh,
where my husband and I stayed at this guest house, and we hired our host for a day to take us to one of the islands outside Seoul. And we both really wanted to see one of the beaches kind of outward towards the ocean. But we never made it there because he kept taking us to these military landmarks from little spot to little spot. And, by the time the day was over, we had never made it to that beach that we wanted to see. So I couldn't help myself at the end of the day. And I just said, I'm really sad that we didn't make it there. My husband was walking a little bit further ahead. It was just me and our host, who was a man, I think about twice my age. So his reaction never came.
oh,
It was as if I had said nothing. He just completely pretended like he hadn't heard it, like I hadn't said anything. And later, I got so worked up about this. So I was talking to a friend of mine who's a multicultural trainer.
uh-huh.
And she said, well, a younger woman telling him off. Yeah, it was probably it was probably not something he was used to.
Wow.
So he either didn't know how to handle it, or it was the saving face thing. Like, there's nothing wrong here. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. You
So
know,
that to me was a really a really moving experience. It made me very, very frustrated, and I felt like there was nothing I could have done about it, because how else could I have expressed myself? Of course, there probably are all sorts of other ways that I could have done this, but in the moment, uh, yeah, I just felt
in the
like, oh,
moment or not, because that wasn't something that fit within whatever cultural values he was using.
absolutely,
Either a
absolutely.
woman or how could anyone put a beach more important than our military presence? What happened for you then? Because that's
I
really
got
important.
really frustrated and angry and irritated,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I let it go because I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, and there was nothing to be done about it anyway. So it wouldn't have got me anything. I just wanted to be heard, which I wasn't. So,
Well, the word that comes to me as I hear you is invisible. You became invisible.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that becomes an important word when we're talking cross culturally because of the lens we're using, how invisible some parts of people become because we can't see them and we can't connect. And the other thing this is bringing up for me is there is research that we also believe we're so much more culturally sensitive than we actually are. And it's a dramatic difference. Don't quote me on the exact one, but it's something like 86% of us think we're being culturally sensitive when it's only 15% of actual cases that we are.
Well, this is an example of, I thought that I was doing quite well in terms of my multicultural literacy. But in that moment, I really made a blunder because it was not the right thing to do. And I could not think outside of my framing
Yeah.
of, saying how I feel and what I want and what I don't want and being acknowledged for it. And I
Wow.
could not understand that that would not be received, but that was not the priority for our host.
So yeah, this is about a lot of things in these scenarios. But what is striking me as being important as we talk about this is our ability to be sensitive, sort it out, and adapt, how that impacts the other, the different other. And once that gets set up, the question becomes, so how do you manage how it may interrupt connection? Which to some extent, that's what we're aiming from. If we're really trying to join someone else, even in the joining, maybe to be a little different, but nonetheless, it's about connecting with the different other and
Yeah.
how it gets disrupted.
How do you see this happening in today's world of work?
You know, I'm feeling all the kind of contradictions in answering that because one thing is that we are so global that it's almost like we can't afford not to have some sense of working with a culturally different other. And that can mean a lot of different things. Culturally different other can actually be in terms of different types of difference, if you will, like race or gender or that. And what that means in Germany versus what that means in India. But then there's also the work, how what work means differently and how we communicate differently because of these cultural issues. So when you're talking about doing teams that are global, you're talking about very complicated types of interactions based on those. And now you're adding on virtual, okay,
Yeah.
which we know and have to do in those cases where there's such a global reach. But if there's less opportunity to make good connection that enables people to be more forgiving or more accepting or being able to challenge in appropriate ways. And sometimes people feeling they can say more and do more simply because they're virtual in ways they wouldn't if they were in person. So it really complicates things and further complicated by, we're talking about this in May of 2025. And we're in the midst of even more global change and more warlike postures between different countries. We're in a culture and environment now being more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So that's been magnified. And now we're trying to do all this cross cultural connecting and interactions at work in those environments. And there is a theory that behavior is a function of the person and the environment.
So, what do leaders need to know or learn to facilitate good collaboration in this VUCA environment and with the digital layer on top and across multiple countries where organizations now have distributed teams?
Okay, there's a couple of answers to that, but the answers to some extent apply to anybody. What is needed is a different heart set, different mindset, and a different skill set. The heart set has to do with how we bring ourselves there, like having curiosity, like being able to suspend judgment for a while, like being able to be more accepting. Mindset is trying to get some sort of understanding about the characteristics of the different cultures that are being represented in the room. So there's a knowledge base to that. And then the skill set is when you have that many differences and let's acknowledge similarities in the room.
Mhm.
How do you manage that in terms of having the skill to actually help people be more tolerant in the moment, helping people to express themselves a little differently as they're talking with one another, to be aware of the skill set of when teams are highly different versus middle to low levels of differences and what adjustments need to be made according to that. What happens when you bring a leader in with authority and all the projections that go on there in all those different cultures that differentiate between how they deal with authority and
And what authority looks like.
yeah, what authority looks like.
I love this framework of heart set, mindset, and skill set. If you were to point out one behavior that is conducive to good collaboration in a diverse team, what would it be? What would be the one thing that a leader has to do,
You know,
if nothing else?
I can never answer a question like that with one thing. So
Okay,
you're going to
challenge
be dealing
accepted.
with
Three
my
things.
own.
You get three.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll take two. One of
Okay.
them is curiosity. Curiosity is so important rather than jumping to judgment. It's sort of like, oh, wow, I didn't expect this. So, wonder what's happening here. What is this about? And asking questions from curiosity, not asking questions that are really statements. That is, so don't you think that's a really harsh way of saying it versus, whoa, you seem to feel very strongly about that. I'm interested in what you're experiencing, which is the curiosity part rather than the judgment. It's using data as well. The other part is related to what I just said, which is trying to suspend judgment, not give up judgment. When we tell people, don't be judgmental, that's the nature of being human. That's the nature of growing up in these cultures and being taught what's right and what's wrong and learning what's right and what's wrong. And so it's not avoiding judgments, it's being aware of what judgments you're making and suspending that for long enough that you can be curious and get information that may help you make sense of it better. So that's kind of the two things I would say offhand.
Yeah. What about coaches? What does a coach need to know or to learn or to do when they're working with a client who has very different identities from themselves?
I'm thinking of this in two different ways, but one of the ways is one that I was influenced when I went to a cross-cultural presentations by a Peace Corps worker. Actually, she was a trainer for them in cross-cultural work. And she came up with, it's called bridging. And bridging is an intentional way of, again, trying to become aware of what sense you're making of it, but also then trying to take on the perceptual lens that the other person is having. And then the issue becomes, how are you going to adapt or not? And therefore, in terms of us as coachings, what behavior when we're interacting with them, once we understand the perspective they're taking, what adaptations are willing to make about who we're going to be with them.
So, what might inform that decision to adapt or not?
Well, there's an interesting thing because when I was giving this as perspective to a group of coaches, one person came back and you could tell he was really concentrating and he seemed to, in fact, admitted it, was upset at the notion that I have to adapt. So his question was, do we really have to adapt to all of this? And I said, no. And the reason why I said no is you have to be clear what your values are and what the cost to you is about adapting. And it allowed him to express, because he is working in a place where they're abusing children. And I couldn't imagine this, but that came up as their behavior with children that was against his values. And he could not see that is happening. And a smaller example being in a culture where interrupting is okay or talking over each other is okay. And for you, that's a sign of disrespect. And you want to give the person the grace of being able to complete things. And so do you decide how much you're going to adapt and go for interrupting or not? My experience of mentor coaching coaches, and this doesn't even come in as a cultural issue, but it ends up being a cultural issue, is that in International Coaching Federation's competencies for coaches and in Gestalt competencies for coaching, there are statements about appropriately interrupting. And there is so much constraint in coaches, and that is a generalization, but I've been mentoring coaches for over 14 years, that I feel confident of my generalization, that they don't like to interrupt because they see it as disruptive or unrespectable. And there is a real skill in interrupting and a necessity to interrupt if people are only repeating their stories, and stories are what they know. It's how they made sense. And so if they're going on and on and on about their story, they're not getting any new awarenesses. And so it requires a skillful interruption to bring them back or to question. You kind of get what I'm saying, maybe from your own experience.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, I go back to my early days as a coach where I had a story about coaching that was very much in the support space. So I had to learn to expand my range of how I wanted to show up as a coach and to build on my capacity to challenge.
Right.
So interruption was for me at first a way to challenge the client, and still is sometimes, but now I'm beginning to see it, as you say, as a necessity. So it's not even about me anymore.
No, it
It's
isn't.
about what's needed in the moment.
And especially with Gestaltists, where you're trying to raise awareness. So
yes, that's interesting. Yeah, because sometimes I will use interruption to capture the moment. When the client is onto something and I notice they're kind of getting a little bit off track, and no, go back to that.
Absolutely.
So that can be powerful.
Can we slow down a bit here? I would like to focus on this just a little bit longer, because it sounded like you said something really important. So it's the skill is knowing when to interrupt and how to interrupt. And it is about, I wouldn't say balancing challenge and support, but it is about wisely using both. That support all the time without challenge is not necessarily growth producing. So, and getting back to Gestalt, bringing people back in the moment, which is part of an interruption. So now that you spoke about this, what is happening in you now, having said all of this? That's an interruption, going from the story into the now. And it can be really important in breaking that cycle of just going around with story. So yeah, that brings us back to the power of Gestalt.
What would be your Gestalt definition for working with difference as a coach?
Wow, I don't even know if I have one. You know, what it brings up for me is that the power of Gestalt is not in one way of being. The power of Gestalt, in my mind, is the fact we have methodologies. We don't have lockstep ways that you have to do coaching. We have ways of working with polarities. We have ways of working with resistance. We have ways of bringing it into here and now. We have ways of working with phenomenology, which is sharing what you're experiencing in the other person, verbally, content, non-verbally, and what you're experiencing in yourself as a result of being in the presence of the other while they're doing that. So it isn't about one way of dealing with difference. It's about using all the powerful methodology we have with synchronicity together as appropriate to the person and the situation. So, like dealing with differences using polarities is trying to understand in that person's culture what it is that they want on one hand, that is in an apparent conflict with the want they have on the other hand, and helping them determine how they could get some of both and what that would require for them. And I'm moving my hand because we usually represent as infinity loop. So, and in resistance, it would be trying to help the person in that particular cultural content understand what is getting in the way of them getting what it is they want to do or be. And the way we have of framing that as a creative adjustment. So is this a good creative adjustment for the person's culture that they're in? Or is this actually being dysfunctional given the culture they're in? So that question was really hard to answer, as this is what you do. It's how you are being and how you are using the ways you have of sense making and tools you have and methodologies for being with the other and being culturally appropriate as you do that.
If you were to leave the coaches of tomorrow with one thought or recommendation, what would that be?
Be kind and be compassionate with yourself. This is a very complex heart set, mindset, and skill set we're talking about. And it's also done under the umbrella of us having all these biases, some of which we know and some of which we don't. Who you are as a person dictates who you are as a coach as well. It takes intentional work in the areas of this heart set, mindset, and skill set. And in the process, no, you're never going to do it all right, quote, right. And that's where being kind to yourself and compassionate to yourself is really important, because if you can do that for yourself, then you can hopefully do it for the different other as well.
What stays with me from our conversation is that it's not so much about what you do, it's about how you are.
Yes. Yeah, who you are and how you show up and how you are, as you're saying. Yeah. And you also have to be authentic to yourself. Can't pretend to be something you're not and still be effective or connect well. So that is about understanding who you are when you walk into the room with a different other.